Hey, Julian.
Morning, Julian.
Hi. You should listen to the start of my submission. Okay.
I certainly will.
Yeah. People will be buying tickets. Yeah.
Oh, good morning, everybody. We can see you and we've been hearing you, and recording is now in progress. So welcome back to day 2 of our hearing into the application by Second Star Limited at Tampa Bay. Can you just click the got it on that big bubble blocking the screen? Thanks. Before we recommence, Mr. Page, with your planning witness, Mr. Greaves, yesterday as a follow-on, I did indicate to the applicant that we had a couple of questions of clarification of the project's architect, Mr. Kuma. Those were circulated to everyone this morning, which if you have already seen, you will have seen. If you haven't seen them, they are what we'd describe as relatively straightforward clarifications, and the applicant will respond to us on those as it can. We don't propose to otherwise dwell on that. I just wanted to let you all be aware that that's what had happened. And on that basis, Mr. Page, good morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. I don't have anything to add this morning to the presentation that I made yesterday. I simply will introduce Mr. Ian Greaves and to invite him to present his evidence. Ian has circulated a summary statement yesterday, and for the benefit of those who haven't seen or received it, my suggestion to you is that we simply invite Mr. Greaves to read that and then to respond to any questions that you may have of him.
Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Page. I read it yesterday, but it did only come in yesterday, and I'm sure there are other people in the hearing who haven't read it. So we are quite comfortable for Mr. Greaves to just read it. It is only a little bit over a page, so I can't see that being too long. So Mr. Greaves, over to you.
Good morning, Commissioners. My full name is Ian Christopher Greaves, and my qualifications and experience are set out in my statement of evidence dated the 17th of May. My evidence has been prepared on behalf of John May and Longview Environmental Trust and relates to their submission opposing the resource consent application by Second Star Limited to construct a lodge at Tampa Bay, Wanaka. The primary concern to the submitter relates to the landscape and visual effects on the ONL. This has been addressed extensively in the evidence of Mr. Brown, on which I rely. I also agree with and endorse the assessment outlined in the Section 42A report prepared by Ms. Gathercole. Overall, the proposal is to be considered as a discretionary activity. As a full discretionary activity, the Council's discretion is not limited. It is my conclusion that the proposed development is contrary to the objectives, policies, and assessment matters of the PDP in relation to landscape matters. The objectives and policies and assessment matters relating to ONLs impose a very high bar on successful applications, with a started stating point that development is inappropriate in the ONL unless landscape values are protected and the development is reasonably difficult to see. There's nothing exceptional about this site that makes this development appropriate in this ONL setting. The location chosen is not reasonably difficult to see from the boundary, and the evidence of Mr. Brown concludes the landscape values and natural character will be adversely affected by this proposal. The strategic objectives and policies of the PDP require the identification of landscape attributes and values associated with the ONL, an assessment of the effects of the proposal on those values and on related landscape capacity. This assessment is to consider the wider landscape, but rather than just at a site level. An assessment of this nature has not been conducted for this application. In my evidence, I caution the reliance on planting as a key mitigation method for development in the ONL. The application relies on extensive areas of proposed planting to mitigate adverse effects of the proposal. If the success of vegetation planting is less prolific than anticipated, screening vegetation is destroyed by fire, and that results in an unacceptable outcome from a landscape policy standpoint. In my opinion, this points to why location should be the key criteria for determining the acceptability of a proposal. Given Mr. Brown's assessments and conclusions, I consider that the proposed lodge is inappropriate in this ONL location. The proposed lodge's siting, design, and mitigation will not protect the landscape and natural character values of this ONL, nor be reasonably difficult to see. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Greaves. Let's see if there are some.
Thank you, Mr. Greaves. Yes, I do have a few questions for you. I suppose maybe start with the vegetation and the reliance on vegetation for screening and the risk of that being destroyed by fire. Now, I understand that obviously that's a topic which is at the forefront of your mind, given the fire that took place on your client's property. But is that realistically a reason to discount a mitigation which has been extensively used in this district and is, from the point of view of it being natural and having many benefits, is generally one of the more successful mitigation tools?
I think the answers to that question comes down to how much the proposal relies on that from a mitigation standpoint. And what I mean by that is it the only mitigation that is proposed or required for a proposal? And I think in this case, there is a really heavy reliance on it. So therefore, the risk of if there is a failure, the risk or the resulting effect of the failure could be quite substantial. Where if you have another example where the mitigation is only one of the key factors that is making a proposal acceptable for the ONL, then if there is a loss or removal, let's say, of that mitigation, that the extent of effect of that would be less. So I think that's where I'm coming from, that this proposal is very heavily relying on vegetation and in a sense of mitigation, that if, and I accept that's not, it is a potentially a low probability event that it is lost, but if that did occur, there is actually quite a high result and effects from a landscape point of view.
Okay. There's obviously been a lot of talk of permitted baseline and consented baseline and during this hearing, and at least from the applicant's point of view, it's quite an important part of their case. Now, you have, in your evidence, I think, concurred that there is a permitted baseline. Of the existing, for a dwelling in the existing. I'm not sure you've been quite as specific in what the permitted baseline is. You've simply said that it's at our discretion. What is the permitted baseline here in your view?
I think the chairman provided a useful summary of the situation in his discussion with Mr. Edmonds yesterday, and that was a point-by-point comparison of the proposal versus permitted activities in the plans not relevant in this case. However, there is a baseline of changes that could occur on the site, either as a permitted activity or an anticipated activity that contextually would change maybe the look and feel of the site, that will have some relevance to your overall consideration. And as you say, a good example would be a house in the existing building platform. I completely accept that will or could occur on the site. However, I guess I would temper that. In my view, the extent of the comparison is somewhat limited given the scale of what we're dealing with here. But I do accept that those contextual changes can form part of your overall consideration.
Okay. Counsel for your client, Mr. Page, raised the issue of the priority areas and that these have not been correctly dealt with. I didn't pick up quite the same vigor from your evidence. What is your view on this? From a planning point of view, what should we be doing?
Well, I think actually that's the way you describe that is a really important point. I don't think being in a priority area actually determines how, from a landscape perspective, this should be assessed any differently. And what I mean by that is the strategic direction chapter of the plan. The purpose of the priority areas, and taking a step back for a minute, the council, when the plan was notified, there was no identification of values or attributes that were to be prescribed in the plan. The court didn't agree with that approach, but the court accepted that undertaking an assessment of that nature for the entire ONL would be too big a task. And so what they've done to try and reduce the size of that workload is effectively identify priority areas where that is to occur. And where I'm going with that is, I think the key policy which you discussed with Mr. Page yesterday is 3.3.5. Now, the reason that policy is there is actually to deal with the assessment of applications that fall outside priority landscapes. But the only reason it's relevant to this case is that we have a situation where the scheduling required by the prior policies in the strategic directions chapter has not occurred. We're effectively in a gap between the decision being released and the plan changes being implemented, which I understand are due in the coming months. So therefore, I agree that 3.345 needs to be the correct policy that forms part of your consideration. But where I'm going with that assessment is, I actually don't think there's any difference in the way you would assess a landscape proposal, whether it's within the priority landscape or not within the priority landscape. The difference being is that once the scheduling has taken place, the grunt work of the identification of values and attributes has been done for you, because that's actually prescribed in the plan, and therefore you simply need to go and assess the effects on those attributes and values. The difference being, if you're outside the priority landscape, 3.3.45 says you need to do that work up front. So it's a bigger assessment task in front of you because the council hasn't done it for you. And what we're saying in this case, but given that scheduling has not taken place, that identification of attributes and values, and the key point that we've identified on related landscape capacity, needs to be done. I take the view that there's no significant difference. It's just what's in the plan at the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and your point is that the applicant hasn't done this adequately. That was the point I took from Mr. Page, and that's the same point that you're saying.
Correct.
Mr. Greaves, you have extensive experience in this district. Other than the example given by Mr. Page of the 85 hectares planted by Mr. May, Do you know of any other areas of sort of 50 hectares and above that have been revegetated? Oh, and Water Peak, I think was was the other one example given in this district?
I think Mr. Beale identified one in the Wakatipu Basin, but there's not, no, in terms of linking it to a resource consent proposal, no, I don't actually have one.
Thank you.
Probably the only other thing I would say would be, it's probably in combination, but if you look at Roy's Peninsula in terms of the properties on Roy's Peninsula as a whole, I think Brewer property, the Grant property, Mr. May's property, and the extensive areas of vegetation would significantly be above 50 hectares across those properties on Roy's Peninsula. And actually, Mr. Chapman's property, which is the Matuki Tuki Trust property, I'm aware that there's some extensive areas of planting being undertaken on that property. So that's probably another good example, actually, Roy's Peninsula, but they probably from, on a scale point of view, spread across multiple land holdings.
Okay. I don't think I have any more questions for you. Thank you, Mr. Graves.
Mr. Graves, I also have some questions for you. The revegetation, approximately 100 hectares, premised as landscape mitigation, but the applicant's evidence is that it is nonetheless a mitigation that would also deliver numerous positive effects, ecological and biodiversity benefits chiefly. Do you accept that the mitigation proposed would have, whether you call them positive externalities or however they're phrased, positive attributes, as well as a purely functional mitigation role?
Yes, absolutely.
If we were to work through in our evaluation this, however we end up phrasing it, this issue of the alternative hypothesis of a dwelling and one or two farm buildings on the site, possibly very visually obvious, possibly higher on the contour than the current buildings. I think the building platform, as I understand it, is on a slightly higher elevation, and 0 hectares of revegetation. How do we factor in the value of those positive attributes that the 100 hectares of revegetation proposed bring? Do you see where I'm going? I'm trying to understand, although the revegetation is mitigation, it also has 100 hectares of ecological benefit that might not otherwise happen. And I want us to be properly clear in our accounting of those benefits before we are quick to dismiss them.
I think it comes down to, if your conclusion is that there will be adverse effects on the O&L as a result of this proposal, it's not an acceptable approach from an offsetting point of view to then therefore say that that effect will be offset by the biodiversity benefits.
Yeah.
And that's not sound resource management planning practice, whatever you want to call it. So I think it does need to be distinguished. And it's actually a really interesting point you make, because I was actually involved, if you're looking at one of the policies, which is that open landscape policy in the plan. There was the council in their evidence to the court did look at this issue, and I'll read it to you because I actually picked it up last night because I thought of it as the day ended yesterday. The policy, which is the open landscape policy, this is the version that council actually proposed to be put to the court, and that was maintain the open landscape character of the O&L and of ONFs and ONLs where it's open at present, taking into account circumstances where the loss of open character is outweighed by substantial indigenous biodiversity regeneration or enhancement that maintains landscape values. And why I raised that is that the court emphatically said no to that. And it said no to that on the exact basis that we're talking about here, is that you can't offset a potential effect on the O&L using a biodiversity attribute. So I think that gives a good example. I guess the court was alive to that situation. The council was proposing something that you're talking about, but that was very quickly determined to be not an appropriate approach in terms of protecting the O&L values.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Greaves. Does that lead to a district position where, in fact, the signal to people is to not try to restore naturalness, to not try to restore ecosystems, to not try and bring back something closer to the natural state of vegetation cover, because in fact the direction for openness means keep it as farmland, even at the same time the signal might be to retire farmland?
I think the risk is trying not to promote development on the proviso that it's it's a biodiversity gain. So you get.
Yes. I understand. What you're saying is it's about whether or not it's being premised as mitigation of development effects in the first instance.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I want to go to this issue of the incomplete landscape assessment in your paragraph 6, and I think it was policy 3345. Let's say, for the sake of the question, you've persuaded the panel, and we should say Mr. Page as well, as he also talked about it, and that we agree that prima facie there has been a failure of that particular explicit assessment. My question is it a proverbial toothless tiger? Because not one of the landscape architects has indicated to us that they felt unable to incompletely or properly assess the full range of landscape and visual effects of this fully discretionary activity. So if there was a failure to undertake an explicit assessment, well, where does it take us if none of the experts have found it to be an impediment in any way? So does that put us in a situation where we might agree that a policy hasn't been met, but it has no material impact on the decision either way? Follow where I'm going?
I do. I think the issue is, in terms of what the district plan is trying to achieve, you don't have enough information in front of you right now to actually conclude. And the point that we make, and I make in my evidence, is largely around capacity. And how can you assess the effect on capacity when you don't know what the capacity is in the first, at that landscape wide point of view? So I think it's quite material in so far as what the plan is trying to achieve here. The plan's very much trying to move away from that site-by-site analysis that the ODP relied upon. And the court was really clear that that wasn't resulting in good O&L outcomes. And that's the point that it's trying to achieve. So I think it's really important that and in fairness to the applicant, and I absolutely put it this way, is that when this application was lodged, this policy didn't exist. So it's a very new thing. So, potentially you're in a situation that it hasn't been raised in any serious consequence from the landscape architects, because it's very, very new. I mean, it's the first time I've been involved in it being engaged. So, and probably is for the landscape architects as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Greaves. I think in my mind, it would be a simpler matter to get my head around if the 3 landscape architects had only provided a pure mechanical assessment of visual effects. But for each of them, they've provided extensive commentary on the planning framework of the PDP. And so either they've read the policies and found that they are satisfied, they understand those attributes, or they haven't fully understood the plan. So I think where I'm going in my head is, if I am to agree with you, I need to almost find that the landscape architects haven't correctly understood the plan. Is that fair?
I think I agree with you in part. I think if you look at particularly the applicant's assessment, there's a very clear and Mr. Milne does a very clear identification of attributes and values throughout the original landscape assessment lodged, and then Mr. Milne's evidence put forward for this hearing. The gap, the big gap that I see is around the capacity issue. And as an example, I don't know if you picked up, but attached as Appendix A of Mr. Brown's evidence was a similar line of, attached as Appendix A was an example of what this might look like. And that was a joint witness statement between Mr. Brown, Bridget Gilbert, and Yvonne Fluger. And it was to do with the plan change at Parkins Bay. And I just think this gives you a really good example of what I understand and what the landscape architects that were involved with that Parkins Bay case understand, that assessment of how or what the plan's trying to achieve under that policy framework where it might look like. And we don't have an assessment of that nature in front of you for this landscape.
So, in a second. So Mr. Greaves, I just want to finish my train of thought, then Commissioner Baker wants to ask you a follow-up. There's no specific consent requirement related to the undertaking of this assessment, is there? It's a matter of following the policy. That's correct?
Yeah, I agree.
So if an applicant were to provide information purporting to do that evaluation, how through a resource consent can we do anything other than accept that without us trying to do the plan making job of determining definitively what those matters are through everyone else having a say and providing their own contrary assessments? How do we actually do it through a resource consent?
Well, I think it would be reliance on Mr. Denny for the landscape evidence from council's perspective to give a view on the acceptability of the acceptability of that from a professional standpoint.
Well, careful, because Mr. Denny's here in the regulatory capacity of the council, not the policy writing capacity of the council. So he might be entirely happy with an applicant's assessment, but it might not be definitive as the council, as consent authority plan writer.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from there, and I guess that this is what I was alluding to when I was talking to Commissioner Baker, was that the policy is the main reason that policy exists is for the assessment of an application that was outside the priority landscape, and it's only engaged here because the work hasn't taken place. But my thinking is that it doesn't make sense in my mind that there would be a different approach for the way an application was assessed as to values and attributes. It's just simply that grunt work's been done up front within the plan, if that makes sense.
Yeah, look, thank you, Mr. Greaves. I appreciate you grappling with this new policy and sharing your thoughts with us. Commissioner Baker did have
I just have one short question for you, because obviously this, to some extent, my understanding is this is a kind of other side of the hill to the Wakatipu land use study, which hasn't gone a lot further with its capacity assessments. And I'm just wondering what experience you've had with that, given that the courts are quite a long way through that. We have capacities set in general, and then we get resource consents, which are very site specific. And in many cases, in my experience, are advising how the general capacity doesn't actually apply to their site. And actually the outcome that we are getting is very similar to what we are getting here. So I'm just wondering what your experience is and whether your experience is the same as the one I'm describing.
In fairness, I haven't had any involvement with the Wakatipu landscape.
Okay, that's fine.
So I'm probably not in a good position to answer that, sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay. Look, thank you, Mr. Greaves. We have no further questions for you, and we appreciate your time and care. And congratulations also on completing the school drop-off in time.
No worries. It was good. Thanks. Thank you.
Well, that completes then the evidence for Mr. May and the Longview Environmental Trust Commissioners. Unless you have anything that you particularly require assistance from us, then that completes the presentation.
Yes, that's all for us at this time, Mr. Page. Thank you. Our final submitter, at least in terms of what we've been told, Mr. Hayworth, appreciate you've been sitting through yesterday waiting patiently. We have read your submission, so please don't feel obliged or, in fact, please don't read it to us again, but by all means speak to it and share with us your thoughts. So over to you.
It's actually evidence, as you'll appreciate. Good morning, everybody. What I'm going to do is to highlight some key points in my evidence and then comment, make brief comments on some of the evidence and submissions that we've heard previously. But to start with, yesterday, counsel for the applicant criticised the Environmental Society for going to the media in relation to this application. It's entirely appropriate for a small community environmental watchdog group to bring a potentially very intrusive development in outstanding natural landscape to the attention of the public through New Zealand's free press. Can I suggest that the applicant leave his anti-democratic ideas in the United States when he comes to New Zealand? Now, moving on to the application. First of all, I endorse and support the excellent submissions made by Mr. Page yesterday, especially in relation to the primacy of the PDP chapters 3 and 6 policy framework, with which I am very familiar. I have to say the chapter 3 policies, you have to go into a darkened room where it's very quiet to understand them. Yeah, they're a bit convoluted, hey, but moving on to paragraphs 9 and 10, and of course this is the famous PDP policy 6331, reasonably difficult to see. Now, Mr. Page was correct where he said yesterday that the objectives and policies in chapters 3 and 6 of the PDP are more directive than those in the ODP. In particular, as I say in paragraph 10, development within ONL is required to protect landscape values and to be reasonably difficult to see. And I'll return to this point. Well, I'm going to continue with it now. Actually, I want to reiterate Mr. Page's point here that the reasonably difficult to see criteria is not a broad assessment where if a development is only visible from a couple of places, the criteria is met. I consider that the proposed buildings in this application will not be reasonably difficult to see when viewed by many thousands of boaties from the lake annually, and when viewed by many thousands of people walking or riding, biking, using the Te Araroa track. This alone is enough for the application to be contrary to this policy. In paragraph 11, I talk about the buildings proposed, the row of buildings proposed and the associated lodge management buildings, and the fact that the buildings stretch for 330 metres. Now, yesterday, the commissioners raised significant issues in relation to the back of house building and the design and use of this building, and the way the staff needed to run the visitors' accommodation will be recruited and accommodated. The answers from the applicant's witnesses in response to the commissioner's questions, I think it was Commissioner Baker was asking some good questions here. The answers to the applicant's witnesses in response to the questions sounded unconvincing in my ears. I remain concerned as to exactly how the visitors' accommodation will operate and where the staff needed to run the visitors' accommodation will live. There were also questions from the commissioners yesterday about whether the buildings proposed in the application are consistent with rural character. It's a good question, yeah. I can't see how a row of buildings 330 metres long can be said to be consistent with rural character. Show me a rural activity that looks anything like that. Now, I listened to the discussion on the permitted baseline buildings this morning and yesterday, yeah? And the permitted baseline farm buildings would be expected to be seen in a landscape like this. That's the first thing. You'd expect to see those buildings. And my understanding is that they're a controlled activity, controlled in terms of location, so that the visibility of those buildings is minimized, so that they fit into the landscape. I'm not 100% certain of that, but I think that's the case. So those buildings aren't going to stick out. You know, they can't just be plonked anywhere in the landscape. Paragraph 13, I talk about the 7.4 hectares of earthworks proposed. Now I've heard in the past landscape architects describe earthworks like this as playing God with the landscape. And I have to raise the issue, when you have to do a large quantity of earthworks like this, you have to question whether you have the right location for the buildings. In paragraph 14, I list the possible domestic clutter that will come with the development, and it's all listed there in paragraph 14. Now, yesterday, the architectural video we saw illustrated hardly any of these effects, any of that clutter. I think there was a swimming pool in there, yeah? I question whether that video was realistic. I also noted that most of the buildings shown in the video as being previously designed and built by the architect were in urban locations. ONL is a very different environment to urban landscape. It requires very different skills. Paragraph 16. Having heard the evidence yesterday and this morning, I remain convinced that the visual impact of this accumulation of development and associated large-scale earthworks will be extremely unlikely to meet the reasonably difficult to see criteria required by policy 6331. Paragraph 19. And here I'm talking about my photographs A and B, which are attached to my evidence. I assume you have them, sir?
We do.
Thank you. Now, yesterday, the applicant's legal submissions said that any views of the proposed development are from a considerable distance. The views in photos A and B are not from a considerable distance. Neither are views I had of the development from the Te Aroa tract from a considerable distance. Paragraph 21, again talking about photos A and B. I noticed the applicant's legal submissions said that the facades illustrated in photos A and B were inaccurate. As can be seen in the photos, the facades are based on the poles grudgingly erected by the applicant. Paragraph 24, I discuss photo C, which I took from the lake. Now, I maintain that the elevation of the proposed buildings when viewed from this location is striking. The sheer scale of the proposed development in the landscape is also revealed, remembering here that only 2/3 of the buildings are shown in that photo. Paragraph 29. In relation to clustering, I consider that the applicant's claim that the proposed buildings will be clustered to be far-fetched. Moving on to cumulative effects, paragraph 32. The failure of the operative district plan to control cumulative effects has become a pivotal issue in the PDP hearings. Now, in paragraph 32, we have the very strong strategic policy. This policy says it must be ensured that landscape values within ONL are not compromised by cumulative development. Ensured. This is a very strong policy. And I go on to list all of the cumulative effects here. Paragraph 38. The Environment Court has decided that we've talked about this a lot already, that the ONL area that includes the second star subject site should be designated a priority area, where this designation is specifically applied to areas under development pressure. That is where landscape values are threatened by the cumulative effects of development. Yeah. Now, Mr. Page is correct here, and Mr. Greaves as well, we heard this morning, yeah, where he said yesterday that if the values identification framework landscape analysis is not yet able to be referenced by the proposed district, by the PDP, and this will happen in a plan change that will take place in June. So that will become available. The studies have been done. The plan change happens in June, next month. Yeah, but at the moment they can't be referenced by the plan. If this hasn't happened, then the applicant has a duty to carry out this analysis, especially with regard to the development capacity of the subject site. The applicant hasn't done this. The applicant has ignored the strategic policies in Chapter 3 of the PDP in this regard. And I think Mr. Greaves backed that up this morning. Now, I disagree. The Commissioner's asked the question this morning where they were talking about this VIF analysis, VIF landscape analysis, values identification framework, landscape analysis may not be needed because you have enough information in front of you. Well, no, it's mandated by the plan. Paragraphs 42 and 43. Now, the issue of openness was I thought, underplayed by Mr. Milne in his evidence and in his replies to questions yesterday. I thought he underplayed that. Policy 6335 is important here, and you have that in front of you. My paragraph 43, I consider that constructing a series of standalone buildings laterally 330 metres across the landscape in the manner proposed will significantly disrupt the existing open landscape character of the subject site. The single residence currently able to be constructed on the consented residential building platform on the subject site, which has a width of around 50 metres, will not. Paragraph 46. I'll have a sip of my coffee here, certainly. Here I talk about the possible uses of the building. There's no certainty that it will be used in the manner described. Now, the applicant could build the entire complex, costing many millions, the whole thing, and leave it empty. It could be a conference centre, it could be an event centre, it could be a nuclear bolt hole. It's very difficult to impose and enforce conditions that require the complex to operate as visitors' accommodation. Now, given that this is the case, this throws the positive economic effects, much touted by the applicant, into doubt, and it also possibly throws the landscape effects of the application into doubt. Paragraph 48. There's no open space covenant or any other type of covenant being offered in perpetuity by the applicant that would prevent further development on the subject site. Now, so the applicant could well come along in 5 years' time and apply it for more buildings on the site. The Society will regard a covenant preventing further development on the site in perpetuity as a positive effect, though this would not mean that the development proposed would become appropriate. And Mr. Brown's evidence yesterday is relevant here. Now, we've also had a lot of discussion about the environmental regeneration and 50 hectares of that and 50 hectares of taking grazing off the site to bring it back to something like its original state many years ago. Now, I accept that there are positive effects for that regeneration. I'm sure the site will be better. And Mr. Greaves is right that they're doing the same kind of thing on Royce Peninsula. Yeah? But this should not be used to justify an inappropriate development. What should be happening here, a good landowner would build a house in the wonderful location where the consented building platform is already consented building platform on the site, on the subject site. And a good landowner would do all this work on this ONL site in conjunction with that consented house, where you can build a very big house on that building platform, by the way. That's what should happen. It shouldn't be used as an excuse to build an inappropriate development. And I think that's been broached by other people before in evidence, yeah. Finally, I'm going to just talk about the submission from the Applecleuth Tracks Trust. Now, the Applecleuth Tracks Trust do a fantastic job. I know people on it. The tracks that they've put in around here are fantastic. They're well used. Usually they do a wonderful job, okay? Now, but the evidence yesterday, and here I'm talking specifically about the part of the Te Aroha track that goes around the point, to the east of Damper Bay, that point to the east, towards Wanaka. So that's that part around the point towards Wanaka. And the track there is proposed to be located, yeah? Now, first of all, I'm highly skeptical of the Tracks Trust claims that said something like, only a fraction of people can use the track in its current state, and the track use is severely limited because of its current state. Now, I'm an overweight 68-year-old, and I have often and recently walked and e-biked the track in its current location with little difficulty and with huge enjoyment. Anybody half fit, and I'm hoping the commissioners will walk this track, of course, and anybody half fit is able to walk the track. Anybody with a reasonable e-bike can bike the track. And as Mr. Howard said in his evidence, some non-e-bikers use the track as a training route and have no problem. So it is only a relatively small number of non-e-bike people who have difficulty with the track. They have to push their bikes up hills 2 or 3 times for 5 minutes, while at the same time looking at the fantastic view as they do that. It's not really a hardship. In my opinion, the track is wonderful in its current location. The Tracks Trust proposal to move the track will not only result in inferior views potentially, but it will also result potentially in I think it will result in adverse landscape effects. And I consider there's little or no merit in the Tracks Trust proposal to move the track in that particular location going around the point, that is. In fact, the proposal is likely to result in an inferior track with poorer views. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that. You're happy to take any questions we have, I assume?
Of course, sir.
Okay, let's see. Any questions? No?
Sure. Mr. Howard, interested, I'll just pick up your last point. I just want to understand why Mr. Howard would be promoting an inferior track. It seems a little contrary.
He's a mountain bike specialist, yes. The Tracks Trust as a whole, and I'm very familiar with these guys, they have these very tight standards to bring tracks in so that the general public can ride these tracks as easily as possible. So they have certain widths and angles, and the track that's on the lakeside at the moment, I fully accept that doesn't meet those standards, but they're kind of a little bit obsessed, the Tracks Trust people, if I can say that. They're wonderful people, but you know, they're always going for the ultimate best track, and that's what Mr. Howard was saying yesterday. Sometimes you just don't need that, is what I'm saying. The track is fine in its current state.
You said that there's no certainty what these buildings will be used for. but you are experienced enough in resource consent to understand that you get consent for a certain activity, and that is what you have consent for. So if we are granting or asked to grant consent for visitor accommodation, then in the event consent is granted, it's for visitor accommodation. It's not for a conference or event centre, except to the extent that that would fit in with visitor accommodation. A small level conference, to my mind, does fit in visitor accommodation. And it's not for a nuclear bolt hole. We're not asked to consent residential. So I'm not sure what your point is, other than to suggest that somebody won't use their application or their proposal in accordance with what they're asking for, which is a little bit beyond our remit to deal with.
Yes, I understand all of that. You're quite right, of course. But once it's built, it would be very easy for the applicant to apply for a different use. And I realise that would have to go through a whole new hearing. Yeah. Possibly that wouldn't be publicly notified, though. Yeah, so that's one thing. And the second thing is, and I know you're not allowed to take this into account, but enforcement of what they actually do there is almost non-existent in my experience.
Clutter. So on basically building on that same point, this is an application for visitor accommodation. The domestic clutter that you're listing and a high-end lodge don't seem to be related to me. This is not a residential activity where we expect motorbikes and caravans and boats and trampolines. This is a high-end lodge. I think domestic clutter, you may have overstated that a little, do you feel?
Possibly. I didn't say all of this will happen. Yeah. But things do happen around buildings. Once you have buildings, even around visitor accommodation, things start to develop, in the curtilage area around the building. There's a tendency for that to happen. And I'm speaking from experience here, not from, sheds start to go up and things, So I accept that it's a little bit overstated in my evidence, but I was never saying that all those things would eventuate, but some things will.
You've directed us to policy 3.3.23. Just quoting from your evidence, I haven't gone and checked it, but it says, ensure the effect of cumulative subdivision and development for the purposes of rural living does not compromise. Is this rural living? Because I don't think it is.
No, it's not. No.
So I would say that policy isn't applicable. So you're on reconsideration?
Assuming that there are other cumulative effects policies, which I perhaps should have included, but it doesn't. I mean, you're right. Yeah. So unless, of course, it is used for rural living at a later stage, but you're accepting its visitor accommodation. It certainly doesn't take the application out of the cumulative effects analysis, though. You'd appreciate that.
I'm simply questioning you directing us to this policy, which to me doesn't apply. So
yes, I accept that.
Okay, I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Mr. Howarth.
Look, for my part, I've got two questions for you. The first, I just want to follow up on one of the questions Commissioner Baker put to you. And I'd have to say I agree with her observation that we wouldn't be able, or I think even be inclined to take anywhere the what if suggestion if they don't want to use this for VA or they want to do other things. But in fairness to you, what I thought you were perhaps trying to say was that the visitor accommodation related economic benefits might not be definitive and we shouldn't use them as a basis to justify the adverse landscape effects you're concerned with. If that's the point you were trying to make, then I think that would be an admissible consideration for us to work through. And it speaks to how we might evaluate and balance or otherwise treat the different adverse and positive effects we're being told might eventuate. Is what I've just described consistent at all with what you were trying to say, or were you really just saying we can't trust the applicant?
No, in fact, I think I said somewhere that it throws into doubt the economic benefits. No, you're right. I don't think that you can use, and I think this goes back to King Salmon, like Mr. Page was talking about yesterday. I don't think you can use those positive economic effects, which are not certain anyway, to justify an inappropriate development in this landscape. So yes, I'm agreeing with you, sir.
Okay. The last question I want to just discuss with you is about this reasonably difficult to see policy test, and you'll appreciate that it's a matter that the commissioners have been trying to grapple with and think through as the information we've heard through the hearing has come in. And what struck me when you were describing your take on it was how literal you think the words are, and what I want to put to you is a hypothetical. And so I'm not going to suggest whether the applicant has or hasn't done this rightly or wrongly, but I want to put to you the hypothetical of a building that plainly looks like a typical house. And everyone who saw it would know it was a building. And the application of a reasonably difficult to see test would be quite simple. Can I see the bright red house, for the sake of argument? But what if a building had been designed to incorporate curves and vegetation and planting so that, at least in part, if people could see it, they couldn't necessarily tell that they were looking at a building, or at least couldn't tell that they were looking at the full extent of building. And so they might be able to literally see it, but they might not necessarily perceive it in its entirety. Do you appreciate the distinction I'm trying to draw there? Of do you think the policy means even if it looks like a hill, if you can see it, it fails?
Well, if it looks like a hill, it would probably be reasonably difficult to see, but it's my contention. I hear what you're saying, that rather than looking like a normal house, you've got this clever design that fits very well into the landscape, is what you're saying, yeah? And it's difficult to discern as a building. I don't think that will be the case here. I mean, I know the evidence from the architect in front of you is that it blends into the landscape wonderfully. I still think it will be discernible as a building and as a 330 metre wide building to be to the point where it will not be reasonably difficult to see. And I do take that. I do take those words literally. I think we have to.
Yeah, no, look, I absolutely accept that there is contention as to whether or not the applicant has executed its vision successfully. So I absolutely get that. But I really wanted you to address that question of if it was difficult to visually discern, that might be relevant. And I think you agreed that, at least in principle, which is different to whether the applicant's been successful, but in principle, you indicated that would inform that policy. So thank you for that.
I think so. If I can add, you're right. It has to be judged on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. Look, thank you for your submission, the time it took. Thank you for sitting through yesterday. I know these hearings can get quite arduous, especially someone like yourself who does it quite a bit. So thank you for your contribution, and we'll release you and let you go about enjoying the rest of your day as much as you can.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. That, on the information we've got, brings us to the conclusion of submitters that wish to address us. And assuming that is the case, we've got a little bit of time left before we would take a morning tea break. And so our proposal would be that we would move on to the council officers. Ms. Gather-Cole, Mr. Denny, greetings. I think I've seen one or two others in there. I see Mr. Jones's name there as well, albeit the applicant didn't call any particular engineering or infrastructure related evidence, and it doesn't appear to be one of the key issues in contention. But Ms. Gather-Cole, in the first instance, as the reporting planner that's pulled together the report and the various specialists, my preference would be to leave it to you to lead how you would like to respond. But in the first instance, I'd just like to remind you, and also for everyone else's benefit, that at this point in the hearing, it's not for you to feel you need to defend your recommendation or provide a rebuttal or reiterate it to us. It's been taken as read. It's been extremely thoughtful and helpful for everyone and helping them frame their evidence. What we're really interested from you is a discussion based on what you've heard in the hearing and the extent to which it has or hasn't changed your view, whether it's given you any new or different or further things to think about, whether you have any additional matters to share with us, etc. So on the basis of that guidance note, as I say, I'm happy to leave it to you, Ms. Gaffer-Cole, to organise that response.
Perfect, thank you. I think we will start with ecology. I have, as you will have seen, we have 2 peer review ecologists that have undertaken the peer review of the applicant's evidence, and they are both on the call. I'll just note that obviously we haven't had any additional or new freshwater ecology evidence, but they are both about questions if you would like. So we have Ms. Jager and Ms. Teal on the line.
Well, welcome both. I think perhaps the first instance would just be to confirm for the record whether or not you've heard anything that's changed or affected your views. Ms. Jager, for no other reason than I saw your name first, perhaps you go first, and then Ms. Teal. And if there's anything else that's relevant to the decision we have to make based on, again, what you've heard this hearing, we'd be pleased to hear it, and we might have some questions for you.
Thank you, Commissioners. I haven't really heard freshwater come up at all as a sort of a topic that's been addressed. So therefore, I have not changed my opinion. I still think that a freshwater impact assessment in its entirety is necessary to determine the effects of the proposal.
Okay, thank you for that. That was clear. Ms. Teal, we'll just see if we have any questions for Ms. Jager before we come to you. Just bear with me. No, look, I've got no questions, Ms. Jager. I think we can acknowledge that you've been very clear and direct in your approach to conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Teal.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So as with Ms. Jager in the first instance, we just ask you to confirm whether or not anything's changed from what you'd previously advised or reported on.
No, nothing has changed.
Okay. And again, we'll just see if we have any questions for the work that you did do. Just bear with us. No.
I do have a couple of questions for you, Ms. Teal. I just want to understand from you fully, and it wasn't entirely clear from your evidence. Well, obviously, we've since had Mr. Beale's evidence on top of it. Are you in agreement with Mr. Beale now?
I am in agreement on most points, but not all.
Can you be clear which points you don't agree with him on?
It's probably not so much a disagreement as I don't have the information, I don't have the quantitative evidence in front of me to make an informed ecological decision.
On which particular aspects?
On regards to whether or not
directed to your evidence, but I just didn't see it in there.
So no, we weren't asked to provide any evidence. I'm just basing it off the reviews that we've provided to council. And Mr. Beale has referred to it in his response section from point 65 onwards. Probably the first point is I haven't received any quantitative evidence that the area within the construction zone is not a wetland. There were just a few points made in the applicant's submitted information that raised a few flags that might suggest it would be defined as a wetland. I'm not saying it is, but there were a few points that certainly made me think it could be. And secondly,
Ms. Hill, did you visit the site?
No, I have not had a site visit.
Are you based overseas?
No, I'm based in Arrowtown.
Okay. Okay, so whether or not there's a wetland in the construction zone?
Yes.
Okay.
It could well not be. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying I haven't had quantitative evidence against, in terms of plant density and cover, and the NPS and NES for freshwater wetland delineation. Would you like me to continue?
Yes, please.
One issue that I raised was whether or not there was going to be grazing within the proposed planted areas and natural regeneration areas. From Mr. Beale's evidence, it would suggest there is going to be grazing now. And I'm assuming that is sheep grazing. I assume it is stated it's going to occur within the natural regeneration areas and the planted areas. I can only assume that the sheep are going to be fenced in areas where the plantings aren't going to occur, but that detail has not been provided as how the balance between the proposed active and passive regeneration is going to be balanced against the grazing. And as to with the proposed pest monitoring and control, there is pest control proposed, but Dr. Tocker, obviously rightly so, is highlighting that there'll have to be a balance between how you control some species so that they don't, other pest species don't increase, and that it will be a very fine balance to manage. And I haven't sort of, there isn't, the pest management plan has not been drawn up, it's just been offered as a consent condition, and just what the baselines will be around that. There appears to be quite a lot to manage, which will require a lot of detail and oversight. Oh, and apologies, just finally, the Eastern Falcon, which has obviously been talked about, its national threat classification is threatened, nationally vulnerable, not at risk recovering anymore, which gives it a higher ecological value.
Did you observe it? Oh, you didn't go on site, of course.
No, I have observed it within the vicinity of, in the surrounding areas, but I obviously was not asked to go on site.
In your view, the pest management plan, which you have said, Ms. Tocker, relying on, it needs to be carefully managed. Is that going to, and I understand you're saying it's difficult, but obviously we have an applicant here who has significant funds available to them, and the management may therefore be fairly realistic. Will that result in positive ecological benefits overall compared to the site just simply being left as it is, as is currently the case?
Yes, if Dr. Tocker's lizard management plan, which includes rodent pest monitoring and control, alongside Mr. Beale's management plan, if enacted, including all the changes that they've proposed in their evidence, and a pest control plan is created based off that, then yes, there would be an ecological benefit would be gained.
I don't think I have any further questions for you. Thank you, Ms. Steele.
Thank you.
Ms. Steele, I don't have any new questions, but I want to pursue two of the comments you made to Commissioner Baker. I want to start with the issue of sheep possibly grazing in the revegetation area and your uncertainty. Do you just think sheep shouldn't be allowed in it? And
No. Sorry, I'll let you continue. Apologies.
No, the question is, appreciating that you may not have certainty on it, is there or should there be a proposed condition of consent that would allow you to have confidence that without knowing a specific solution now, any effects you might be concerned with could be managed?
Yes, a condition of consent that would give me a level of confidence would be that light grazing would be defined as a particular stock unit, and all stock that are to be grazed within active or passive regeneration areas would be fenced. You can have temporary electric fences outside of any areas that have already been planted, and where any natural regeneration areas. I accept and agree with Mr. Beale's comments that light grazing can help manage weed control in this sort of situation. It just needs, you cannot have light grazing where you are planting, because they will eat the plants. I have observed that at the Walter Peak development that has been noted previously in this hearing. Shelters don't protect from light grazing, but if stock were to be appropriately fenced within these areas, to be excluded from areas that had already been planted and from areas where natural regeneration was occurring, so that seedlings aren't browsed, then that would be fine. It is just that detail that is missing at this point.
I'm reading the last sentence of Mr. Beale's evidence, paragraph 66, which is a response to the Section 42A report. And the sentence concludes, grazing will be undertaken on a seasonal basis with grazing sheep, with grazing areas carefully demarcated with hot wire fencing to prevent sheep intruding into planted areas and where naturally regenerating vegetation is located. Hasn't Mr. Beale just said in his evidence exactly what you've said should happen?
Yes, no, I accept that would be appropriate, provided that is in the environmental and vegetation management plan and conditioned. Yes, I agree.
And have you reviewed that condition to see whether it's there, or you're not sure?
No, I have not been provided any consent conditions to review.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Well, that takes care of my second question, which was going to be about the pest monitoring and control and the proposed management plan, and whether you were satisfied with that condition, but you've just answered that you weren't shown those to comment on. So I won't go there. Ms. Teal, I have no further questions for you, but in light of your confirmation that you weren't provided with the conditions to comment on and the unfairness of asking you to now on the hoof do it, I'm going to just signal to Mr. Holm, who I can't see your name on the screen right now, and I can see you with Mr. Edmonds' name. Mr. Holm, I'd be grateful if you could, on these last two matters you've heard me discussing with Ms. Teal, just make sure you draw out in your reply those proposed conditions and explain to us how they've been provided for. Thank you, Ms. Teal. I think we can let you go on that basis.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I interrupt briefly?
Let's see where it goes, okay.
While I've been listening to the evidence, I found a reference to the case that Mr. Greaves was talking about in his evidence in answers to your questions, where the Environment Court was discussing the drafting of policy 6.3.3.5. The case is one that I supplied to you in your bundle, which is the 2019 Upper Clutha Environmental and QLDC case. It's the topic 2 decision.
Okay, so you just want to draw to our attention that the case Mr. Grage referred to as one you provided.
Yes, and the discussion starts at paragraph 421. It's an enormous decision, but if you go to 421, you will see the court's analysis of the drafting of that policy.
All right, thanks, Mr. Page. Look, I appreciate you just confirming that that is before us, but I'd like to just stop it there and not.
I'm not going to say anything about it, just help me find it.
Thank you, Mr. Page. Ms. Gather-Cole, we'll go back to you and your next topic, please.
Thank you. I'll invite Mr. Jones to speak and take any questions.
Hello, I am here. My camera typically doesn't work, so
that's okay, Mr. Jones. Welcome.
Hello. I didn't have anything else to say. I don't think I've heard anything that changed my view. As an aside, I thought of tree space as a project with a massive amount of regeneration.
Sorry, could you speak a little louder, Mr. Jones?
Yeah, I also didn't hear
okay.
that, Mr. Jones, so just start that sentence again.
Yep, is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. I don't have anything that's changed any of the findings of my report, but I did think of tree space, which has quite a bit of regeneration. If that was of interest to you, I asked a few people about that.
Okay, thank you.
But happy to take questions.
Thank you. Let's find out.
I do have one question for you, Mr. Jones, and it's slightly, only slightly linked to engineering, really. There were some comments, I think, in Mr. Denny's report that the infrastructure required for this proposal has not been fleshed out enough for him to fully understand where structures and other paraphernalia will go. Can you explain for us briefly what detail is still to come in, which would basically come in under your engineering acceptance condition, and what structures may be involved in that?
There is a bit of detail's been provided. I think it was in the applicant's expert evidence in the hearing agenda item about the water intake in the structures there, which looked fairly small and underground, mostly, if memory serves. Probably the biggest thing would be figuring out how many water tanks they're going to need based on the firefighting requirements would be the biggest thing. And this external vegetation drenching system they've proposed, which I'm not aware of anything in the district that's been consented that required such a thing. I have no idea whatsoever how much water needs to be stored to service such a system.
So the 12 water tanks which are mentioned do not include any external dampening system. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct. It would also be, let me just check the condition. It would probably be more than that anyway. The 12 tanks would be 180,000 litres, which is enough firefighting water alone, but you need a reserve above that, so you're not constantly operating your pump, which is really bad for the pump.
Okay, so in any event, we need more than 12 tanks, is your advice to us, and potentially another amount of water storage for external firefighting, should we call it vegetation firefighting?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And is there any other infrastructure which will potentially need to be approved, which we are not conscious of at the moment in terms of structures?
There would potentially be something around wastewater treatment, but it's not, in the scheme of things, a massive volume of wastewater that's being produced. So I would imagine that could be probably contained underground, perhaps hidden somewhere in the back of house building.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Jones. I don't think I have any other questions.
Mr. Jones, just one from me. In Ms. Gathercole's planning report, she did make reference to the separate need for some regional consents to be granted, including for water take, etc. I'm not going to ask you anything to do with the planning or administrative side of that, but from an engineering and infrastructure perspective, isn't it relatively common for district consents to be made on the basis of separate regional consents being needed separately?
I mean, in my experience, we try to get them up front, and I have seen cases where the planners accepted either conditions or advice notes that they be provided later, and then applicants have to come in and vary their QIDC consent, which isn't really ideal, I suppose.
Well, yeah, I don't want you to give any opinion on whether it's good planning practice. That's probably not for you to comment on, but just as an engineer who sees this regularly, it's helpful to understand what you see. So I don't want to take that any further. I just wanted to get your perspective on it. So, Mr. Jones, I've got nothing else to ask. So, as with all the other people we've heard from, I'll just say thank you for your time and effort.
Quite welcome. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Back to you, Ms. Gathercole.
Thank you. We'll now hand over to Mr. Teddy.
Morning, Commissioners.
Hello, sir. Fire away.
I'm not sure how you want me to approach this and what would be the best use for you. I've got a short comment on my landscape report, a minor amendment, and a comment on the application itself. And then I've got about 5 pages of notes on the evidence that's been presented. Is it worth going through each point, or would you rather just ask questions at the end?
I don't know that I want you to read 5 pages of notes to me, and I don't know that you need to approach this, as I said earlier, as a defence or a rebuttal. I think we just need you to just walk us through what, if anything, has changed. I think it's fair to say that the panel will want to ask you questions related to the reasonably difficult to see policy that was discussed at some length. And we will want you to talk to this question of further wider landscape capacity and landscape qualities policy that's been also talked about. I think those are 2 things we particularly want to hear from you about. So if you've got notes on those, by all means, speak to them. Other than that, really, I think it is just about just taking us through anything relevant to your conclusions. But as I said, I don't think we want you to just rebut your report or explain why you continue to agree or disagree with whoever. And it's 22 minutes past 10. How long do you think you might take to walk us through that?
10, 15 minutes at the most.
What you might do, Mr. Denny, are your notes handwritten or were they typed?
They're typed.
Why don't we do this? Why don't we take the 15-minute morning tea break now? Why don't you prepare copies of your notes and scan your notes, unless they are so informally written to yourself you don't want to do so.
Check. Yeah, I think it'll be fine. Yep.
Because I think if they're in a state that you could simply circulate them as a form of summary or notes, it might be easier if we receive that, and then you can just skip through them and not feel you've left anything out, but also not subject me to listening to you read 5 pages of your thinking.
Yes, fair enough. All right, well, I can email those through, yeah?
If that's doable, let's take the 15 minutes now, and when we reconvene, we'll have that, and we can discuss it with you then. So let's say it's 10:25. Let's adjourn until 10:40. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back all. In the morning tea break, we received Mr. Denny's written comments. Thank you, Mr. Denny. We understand they were circulated out as well. Mr. Denny, appreciating that they were just the notes you had written, and it was our suggestion that you circulate them, we're definitely not going to offer any criticism at all. But we will note that lots of the comments would constitute a rebuttal evidence in the ordinary meaning of that word. And what we propose to do is use our own judgment to go through your document and disregard the bits we think are just unnecessary. But interspersed through it, there were interesting and we think relevant points of clarification. So thank you for that in the first instance. What we'd like to do, instead of getting you to just skip through it, because we did read it in full, is we'd prefer to simply jump to questions of you. We accept and take as a given that your overall view hasn't changed and that your recommendation is still that the proposal is not appropriate. We understand that. So are you comfortable if we were just to jump straight to the questions we have for you?
Yes, can I just say one thing? I just apologise. I didn't expect this document to go out today.
It's totally fine, Mr. Denny. There's no apology needed.
The other thing I want to say, I've got an injury to my hand that's resulted in nerve damage. So there's lots of typos in there. There hasn't been spell checked. So just to explain myself. So
yes, look, that's all understood, and I'll just reiterate. I'm grateful that you were willing to share what had not been prepared as a formal statement for the hearing. Questions, Commissioner?
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Denny, the last day or so we've talked a fair bit about the green roofs. I'd just like your view, if the green roofs were not to function as intended, how would they affect the landscape and visual effects of the area?
Yeah, well, I've taken the application as is that this will be feasible, that they can achieve what they're saying they're going to achieve. And my view on green roofs is that they're an excellent way to resolve effects from roofs of buildings, because roofs and buildings are probably the most visible element in the landscape, especially in ours, big wide landscapes. If you can dull that off with vegetation, it's a really, really good effect of mitigation. My understanding of green roofs is it's lower vegetation because of the shallow soil depths and watering and stuff like that. This proposal has shrub lining as well, so I'm not overly familiar with that. But I don't think it's overly critical at the end of the day. I think as long as you get some of those textures and colours in the surrounding landscape, and even if you look at the landscape as it is now, if you just planted that up in pastoral grasses, I think it'd be quite effective in mitigating that roof. So I don't think it's a die in the ditch scenario if some of that planting fails. I think you can still get that result. But I am worried that green roofs are fraught with problems. So I think there needs to be quite a strong condition on that succeeding such.
Just touching on that, in your experience, have you dealt with other projects with green roofs?
Yes, yes, I have. I've done, there's one in the Wakatuni Basin at Bendermere. There's a private dwelling with a green roof. Whereas Parkins Bay is the other one that was raised yesterday. There's a condition on them from the Environment Corp for all those buildings to be green roof, which was changed through the subdivision consent to remove those green roofs. So I've looked into that. I was involved in that subdivision consent, so I looked at green roofs there as well. In terms of applications, it is.
And any opinion on efficacy of those projects?
To be honest, I haven't seen the final outcome for the house in Bendermere. It was kind of a cut and cover type thing. And I've just done an application now for the one in the Wakatuni Basin, which is a similar sort of cut and cover leading into a green roof thing. And they generally, those ones with partial grasses on top. So I understand that's quite feasible to do.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Mr. Denny, you've got on the first page some matters that have come up during the hearing that you hadn't commented on. The inclusion of a view protection condition from one Mount Aspiring Road, I presume you're supportive of that?
Yes, I just think it needs to be clarified on exactly what that means, I guess.
That's a general concept you're supportive of.
Yes, no, that's good. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by a work laydown area.
Well, I haven't seen that previously in the application. Now, Mr. Edmonds, the evidence shows a proposed work laydown area for the construction site and access off the existing access road. I haven't assessed that or looked at that.
Okay. Track realignments and upgrades. Now I'm going to leave that one because my understanding is we are just talking about an easement here, and if the track requires consent, that will get dealt with. So I'm going to leave that one. The bond offer for planting. Now, do you have a view on whether bonds are successful for planting and what kind of level of bond is required?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was involved with the Walter Peak Station subdivision. I've commented lots. It was private residential lots, and it's also got a lodge there as well. And there was an older consent approved by the Realignment Court. They had a bond condition attached to that. I think it was partially implemented in the bond, remaining was about $300,000. I guess it was reasonably large. They are problematic for council to administer. The bond as itself as an incentive to get things done, I think is also problematic. My experience is that the best way to get an incentive to get planting done is through performance standards. So it's up to the applicant to deliver those and prove that they can achieve that, and then the development to proceed. I think without having that in place, there's a real risk that planting may change or planting may fail, or for whatever reason. And that's my experience of looking at re-veg projects as mitigation elements. That's reasonably common. It's actually reasonably common to get variations coming through. And it's a real problem. I'm doing quite a few variations for Parklands Bay at the moment around some of these matters. And it's very interesting in that regard, especially when you've got a development that's relying on compensation measures and positive effects in terms of understanding what value you can put on those in terms of the variation context, without there being detailed quantification of what exactly to be delivered. It's very hard to assess a variation based on that.
So when you're saying performance standards, do you mean that the vegetation should be installed prior to anything else to prove it can be done?
Yes, Walter Peaks, what they have? They have various stages of planting. They did standards based on percentage of ground cover, that was percentage of canopy cover that was achieved. It was different thresholds that were had to be achieved. For Parklands Bay, there's a lot of thresholds around that. There was time frames that they couldn't get lots, couldn't get stages of VA development done until planting had been in place for a number of years. And there's also conditions in that one about planting heights that need to be achieved prior to you can build. And it's pretty typical for an ONL. I think Treescape's one in Wakatipu is the same thing. There's a lot of planting area for trees and stuff that need to get to a certain height before you can develop. So where you have a context where you're heavily reliant on vegetation as your mitigating context, you need to achieve that first, not after.
Okay. Mr. Edmonds' table in paragraph 94 of his evidence, which is all the building sizes and along the road there, which to me is setting out the rural character in a sort of numerical format, or the character. You have said that the landscape content is so difficult that it's difficult to find any relevance to landscape matters. But I think Mr. Edmonds was setting that out in terms of cumulative effects. And I just wonder whether that actually adds anything in that context.
Well, to my mind, it's a statistical analysis of distances and stuff, which is, you know, it is kind of useful to have that background, but you really need to understand the context of each of those sites. Are they sitting in a gully? Are they sitting behind trees? Are they predate the RMA? Do they predate the current plan? What were the conditions that were set in? So to me, that sort of gives you a bit more useful background understanding of that context rather than just a statistical analysis as presented.
Whether or not they predate the RMA, they're there and part of the cumulative effect, sure.
Yes, yeah, that's true. But in the context of this development, you are looking at different planning framework, I guess you could say.
So when you looked at cumulative effects, although you didn't do this particular analysis, you fundamentally looked at these matters.
Sorry, can you say that again?
To some extent, when you did your assessment of cumulative effects, you did look at and take into consideration this built form.
Yes, yeah, I do. I'm looking at existing development in the landscape. Yes.
Okay. And my final question to you is about openness and open character, which is still baffling, and I've noticed every witness has confused those two terms, and I'm still not convinced that they're actually two different terms, but having been told so on many occasions, I have to be convinced that they are. So open character is devoid of buildings and probably devoid of trees and allows open views. Would the vegetation that is proposed on this site actually affect that character? Because in my sort of imagination of this vegetation going in, the views are already substantially varied by topography, which is quite significant even on the area on the subject site between the road and the lake. So lots of views are already blocked to some extent. Will adding the vegetation actually change the openness or open character of this site?
Yes, I agree that there's variability in open character at this site existing. A lot of that currently is through topography. There's undulation. The central valley bit is open character. It's open right through. There's the existing stand of Kanuka close to the foreshore, which under the current consent for the building platform is to be protected. So that's existing. I think planting, it's a bit hard to understand what exactly the final outcome of that re-veg strategy is, to be honest, and I do struggle with that a wee bit. I don't fully understand what the outcome will be. But obviously there's trees and there all sorts of things. So there's going to be a change in open space character, yes. And it will have an effect on the current openness, well, not, sorry, I won't use that word, no, I don't. In terms of the views across an open pastoral landscape on that open central paddock, that will change, yes. So there will be an effect on open character. I think it's a change though. You know.
So it's a change to the open character.
Yes.
Definitely happening. Okay.
But there is value in the open character that's recognised now, and it's recognised in high country landscapes in terms of that, and that will have an effect on that. But I guess what you're seeing is an exchange of values.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Denny. I don't have any further questions for you.
Just want a clarification.
Sorry, could you just repeat the last sentence you gave, Mr. Denny? Commissioner Lewis didn't hear some of the words you said.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I've put a lot of think about this quite a lot in terms of the open character. There's discussion about is there an adverse effect on open space character, and I think there is in terms of the current values of the site. I think those open views across the open partial landscape, but there's potentially also value in the change that's going to occur. So it's a different set of values.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Denny, I've got a few questions. I want to start by following on with this open character openness issue. There's been, I'd say, a degree of agreement that the revegetation proposed would, amongst other things, have some degree of positive biodiversity or ecological effects.
I want to put all of that aside, and I don't want to talk to that about with you because you're not an ecologist. I only want to talk to you about landscape and visual effects. And if we discount for the time being the ecological biodiversity benefits of that revegetation, I'm getting mixed signals, I have to say, from the hearing. And that happens because we have different views. But the applicant's primarily proposing the revegetation to mitigate landscape and visual effects. But I'm being told that the mitigation itself is creating adverse visual and landscape effects because it's detracting from openness. Would the application be better if the revegetation had not been proposed?
Well, I can't do it because I don't think the planning is mitigating that proposal. It's doing to a small degree, but not sufficient to mitigate visual effects. I don't think it achieves that.
Okay, so I just want to be very clear with you. Your view is that whatever affects because Mr. Milne put to us yesterday that the revegetation wasn't about compensation or offsetting or random positive effects or just a good thing to do. He posed it as mitigation. Your view is that whether or not, whatever the motivation for it is, you don't think the revegetation serves a particularly important visual or landscape effect mitigation role. Is that correct?
Well, I guess the argument there is that is there an adverse effect to be mitigated in the existing landscape without the building? The landscape as it currently is in its open character and partial landscape is valued as part of the O&L. It has values attached to that. So there's no mitigation to be done there. You're dealing with mitigation of the building. I don't think it achieves that. So hopefully that sort of answers your question.
Yes, no, it helps me understand your view of things. Thank you. I want to just follow on with one of your concerns about the vegetation, and you talked about, well, what if it burns down? If you're not relying on it to address any particular landscape or visual effect, why do you care?
I guess the argument for this application that there's a compensatory element to it. I know Mr. Milne's saying it's for mitigation.
Yeah.
And to me, this application has put all its weight into the mitigation effects of planting. And I think, to me, that's flawed from the start. I think, to me, the best thing to do is site location from the start and then work from there. I think Mr. Brown touched on this yesterday as well.
Thank you. Just bear with me. I'm just trying to write down some notes from your answers. So following on from that, and that if the revegetation occurs, when I discussed this with the applicant yesterday, it's confirmed its view that it would see that revegetation as an ongoing commitment or requirement, and that if it were to suffer a fire or some other damage, it would be compelled or obligated to remediate or rectify that. Now, putting aside for the time being whether the proposed conditions are sufficient to do that, and let's assume there are conditions available that would achieve it, would that address your concerns at all?
No. Revegetation projects take time, a long time, and they need to be flexible to adjust to learnings of the site in terms of revegetation. And that's come up with most of the reveg projects I've been involved with in this district. It's a long-term process, and you can't sort of have a fire as such, erase that, and then get the clock starting from zero again. And it's not just fire that's the problem. There's other things that happen. This is example, I don't want to name names as such, but there's quite a large reveg project was reliant on mitigation, and it failed because the irrigation failed 1 year, and that was enough to set it back. So it's quite fragile stuff, reveg, to get done and to maintain. And I think Mr. Greaves brought this up too. It's a vulnerable element. A vegetation can be removed, it can be modified. The other thing I just want to just touch on that too is that the planting and around the building and that front paddock area, what I don't understand the application is how much of that planting is going to be allowed to evolve naturally to a climax community of species, which would be tree canopies and stuff like that. How much is going to be trimmed from views to maintain views from the buildings?
Yeah. Look, I don't want to take that further because respectfully, you've had time to assess the application and ask questions on it. And if there are things you still aren't satisfied with, I'm not seeing our role as helping that. But I appreciate your concerns with the principle of the idea of that vegetation readily being re-established if it were to go. And to conclude on that topic, then I'm sort of struggling to see where you would see revegetation of scale as ever being a valid resource management outcome because of its sensitivity to things like fire. Why should anyone bother?
Yeah, no, fair point. And you don't want to de-incentivize these things because there's so many good things that come out of it. I mean, they do add natural character values and all the rest of it. I think the problem is not so much, it's more about you putting all your eggs in one basket. And in other O&L developments, that's really not the way you do it. Park and Spay, development there, the lots are set into the landform, then there's mounting around it, it's essential mitigation, and then on top of that, there's planting. It's all supporting stuff. It's not all in one basket. And I think this proposal is putting it all in one basket, which makes it vulnerable. Okay, this issue that's come up in the hearing about the proposed plans policies for further analysis of landscape capability and capacity and absorption. Yeah.
Do you feel that your assessment has properly reflected on the scale of extent of landscape, or have you only considered the site in isolation?
No, I've looked at the landscape as well, yes.
Do you think there's any further landscape assessment that's required for you to reach balanced view on the proposal?
Not at this current stage, no.
Okay. I want to just circle back to your first answer, and I appreciate, there is a distinction between what's mitigation and what's compensation, etc. If we were to agree with you to the extent that we disagreed with the applicant and said or found that the revegetation didn't really address direct visual landscape effects of the building in the way that mitigation is ordinarily thought of, what effects would the revegetation be compensating?
Well, I guess the argument is that the planting is adding to natural character, natural values to the site. In terms of an O&L, it's a restoration of a pre-existing landscape prior to human occupation and such.
So if we think about section 1041 AB, which directly contemplates positive offsets and compensatory effects, do you have any sense as a landscape architect, and you can't speak to the biodiversity and ecology benefits, do you have a sense of what scale of revegetation would be required on the site before the adverse effects of the buildings could be said to be fully offset or compensated for?
I guess my view is I don't think it can achieve that. I don't think it's right to try and weigh those two off against like that.
I mean, do you accept that the law is what the law is and we're obliged to consider it?
You are not a planner expert, but yes, I guess so, yes.
Okay, look, I won't take that further with you, in fairness, Mr. Denny. I don't have any other questions for you. I want to talk about one thing, though, and that is that you, similar to the previous witnesses, have confirmed that you hadn't reviewed or seen the conditions of consent and haven't commented on them.
Yeah.
I'm thinking through what I want to do about that, and I want to discuss it with the hearing before Ms. Gathercole offers any commentary. My reading of the papers is that the application, when it was lodged, did not include any proposed conditions of consent, and that what the applicant's done has been to rely on the Section 42A report and the council's starting point of advice to the panel, which it has then added to through its expert evidence of Mr. Edmonds and others. And that approach has the consequence, of course, of meaning the council's experts have never had a chance to sit and actually work through what conditions the applicant was actually proposing or volunteering, other than specific recommendations and specific technical reports. I want to signal that the panel will probably adjourn the hearing and have a little bit of a chat about it to decide what we think we want to happen before Mr. Holm addresses us as part of the reply. But I want to float for people to start thinking about that one option may be that we ask the applicant, as part of preparing a right of reply, to put together a final set of what it feels the conditions of consent might be, and that as part of that, it consults with the council's officers, because partly the conditions are council's officers' own suggestions to start with, or standard conditions of the council, and others there may be practical wording that a group of experts on one topic might happily agree is suitable, accepting that the officer position is to oppose the consent overall. I don't want to invite any comment on that at this time. I'm just signalling to the hearing that it's not really desirable for us to have a situation where council assessors haven't really felt they've seen or commented on proposed conditions. That's a pretty fundamentally important matter, and I'm not really interested in attributing responsibility or blame. I just want to get from where we are now to the best situation in terms of making a decision. So I'll leave that for people to think on. Mr. Denny, thank you again, and also once more for being willing to share your unedited, naked comments. It takes a brave person to do that, so thank you. Ms. Gather-Cole, we can, I suspect, move on to you.
You. I do have a few short notes. It's not a 5-pager. Just to clarify my thoughts on the hearing to date. I won't repeat anything in my 42A report because obviously that's been taken as read. And I just note initially that having considered the evidence presented by the applicant, the submitters, and the other council experts today, I stand by my recommendation. I'll just go through a few corrections, clarifications to my 42A report. So I have identified that a discretionary consent is required under Rule 25.4.5. That was for earthworks within a statutory acknowledgement area, Tupuni or Nohana. And I previously considered consent was required because of the values attributed to the Wahitapuna area. I have since discussed with the Council Policy Department that and can confirm that consent isn't required under that rule.
25.4.5.
Yes.
Is that because this isn't in a Wahitapuna?
It is in a Wahitapuna. I'll just grab the rule. So, oh, sorry, I've made a mistake. Sorry, you're correct. It's 25.4.6. Sorry about that. Consent is required under 25.4.5, but not 25.4.6. Sorry about that.
That's because it's not in a no hoana.
Yes.
Okay.
In relation to policies 21.2.1.10 and 21.2.1.11, which are referred to my 42A report, I agree with Mr. Edmonds that these policies are not relevant given the definition of commercial activity specifically excludes visitor accommodation.
Sorry, which page is that on, Ms. Gather-Cole, of your report?
It is it's page 36. I'll just check on of my report.
Which ones are we striking out?
21.2.1.10 and 21.2.1.11. In relation to objective 21.2.9 and policy 21.2.9.3. So I believe those are also on that same page.
They're at the top of page 37.
Yes.
Are you striking those out as well?
No, not striking out, just changing. So I have said the proposal will be consistent with this objective and policy, given that the proposal includes significant ecological planting and enhancement, which was an error. I can confirm that I consider the proposal will be contrary to this objective and policy because it will not adequately protect landscape and natural resource values and will not maintain the character of the rural landscape, in my view.
So I just want to be clear that your report was that it would be consistent, and your clarification is that it is contrary.
Yes.
It's not really a clarification, is it? It's a change of view. What was the reason for such an about turn, which is of itself appropriate, of course. But
yeah,
it's not a correction as such, is it?
Sorry, what was that?
You haven't given us a correction of such. You've had a change of view.
No, it is a change of view. Yes, I agree. I had obviously initially incorrectly read that objective policy.
Okay.
I had focused on the natural.
Okay. Understood. Let's move on.
So just to confirm, I didn't have the evidence of Mr. Milne at the time I wrote my fully trade report, but having reviewed it since, I am of the same view and accept the expert opinion of Mr. Denny in relation to landscape matters. Similarly, I wasn't aware of the proposed track realignment at the time I wrote my report, and I agree that it would have some positive effects, but my opinion still stands that the adverse effects will outweigh. Sorry, the positive effects will not outweigh the adverse effects. And then I just have a few comments on the conditions of consent, focusing on those relating to the ecological and vegetation management. I think maybe that was discussed briefly by Mr. Denny, but I had some concerns just around the detail in there. I think it's difficult to understand what outcomes will be achieved and whether those conditions will achieve those outcomes without seeing a lot of the detail at this stage. So I think at the moment we don't have detail on things like density, what sort of coverage may be achieved, for example. I think those sort of things would be quite useful to have in the conditions to be able to understand what to propose and to allow for monitoring to be undertaken. Can you identify for us specific condition numbers that you feel are not workable? Sure. Condition 37.
Sorry, is this with reference to your conditions or Mr. Edmonds?
Mr. Edmonds. So 37 is really the key policy, key condition in relation to the ecological and vegetation management plan. And there are a number of letters in there which address some of the outcomes, but I think there is enough detail in there, in my view. And just another point in relation to the timing, I think, so there are some conditions in there which will allow a review as such of those outcomes and whether they are being achieved or not. But I know that they're on a 3-yearly and a 10-yearly basis. So I think in my view, it would be more beneficial to have a shorter timeframe there. So a 1-year review time, for example, rather than those 3-year and 10-year timeframes.
In terms of the outcomes required of the condition, are you advising us that the existing requirements are not specific or sufficiently clear? Or are you saying that there are additional matters that are not currently identified that should be added, or both?
Potentially a bit of both. I think, as I say, it's difficult without seeing, the detail of this plan at this stage. So I think, obviously the process will be that this information will be submitted to the council for review, and there'll be potentially discussion through that. But I think some of that detail would be good to include.
Do you accept, in a general term, the resource management validity of management plan type approaches to deal with detailed matters of an application?
Yes.
So as much as you and other council officers have expressed a view you would have liked to have seen some of these matters up front, can we take those comments as preferences rather than a fundamental requirement before you could actually indicate agreement to a potential condition of consent?
Yes, that is my planning view. Obviously, it's up to your discretion to determine whether you've got enough information to make a decision on the application and then look at conditions, obviously.
Ms. Gathercole, have you been involved in consents with significant revegetation and are able to give us some understanding of what has been done in terms of management plans in those? Unfortunately, I can't think off the top of my head of any particular cases with this scale of revegetation.
Okay, look, why don't you just carry on, Ms. Gathercole, and we might pick up some of this in our questions to you.
That's actually the end of my application.
Okay. Well, that was what a happy coincidence. So, what would you and the officers ideally like to see in terms of the proposed conditions as they are now sitting before us as per Mr. Edmonds' evidence, and accepting that the staff position is to refuse consent?
In my view, I think some of the key criteria, I think Mr. Denny mentioned performance standards would be useful to understand, for example, the coverage area of the vegetation to be planted, if there is a required height to be met. I guess those types of criteria would allow for it to be measured and monitored from the council perspective.
Okay. Let's just see what questions the panel has for you. Thank you. No? Any questions you want to answer on this?
Ms. Gathercole, I have raised with the other planning witness, or at least with Mr. Edmonds, I don't think I actually raised it with Mr. Greaves, that in my view, consent is still required. No, sorry, I'll shut up. No, that was not true. The issue of the permitted baseline and the residential building platform on site, do you consider that is a strict permitted baseline?
Yes, I consider it a permitted baseline, noting that there is obviously there is still an appeal to that PDP rule, which means that the ODP rule is still triggered in the controlled activity.
Okay, so is your advice that it's a permitted baseline under the PDP, but we can't give it full weight, or is your advice that there is no permitted baseline?
My view is overall there is no permitted baseline given that appeal stands at this point in time.
Are you able to give us an explanation of how the council has dealt with this concept of consented baseline that has been raised in evidence, which is the sort of general feeling of what might occur on this site, or that's how I'm interpreting it?
Yes. I mean, I think it's not a technical planning term that I'm aware of, but obviously it can be considered as part of that potential environment, if you like, in terms of what may be anticipated on the subject site. So I think it is potentially relevant there in some ways, but I think it's not a technical term like the permitted baseline that we can rely on.
In your summary of actual and potential effects on page 30, you have said that you consider that there are some positive effects resulting from the proposal in relation to tourism, economic, and owing to the large amount of planting, ecological enhancement proposed. Given the concerns that you have just raised with the coverage and the amount of planting that's proposed, how have you been able to assess this? How have you been able to decide how relevant those positive effects are?
Well, I think ultimately there will, when you propose a planting, there will always be some sort of positive effect from an ecological perspective, and I accept that. Yeah, I think the tricky thing is it comes back to that question of what is compensation, positive effects versus what is mitigation, and how that all fits in together. So yeah, my view on the ecological side of things is that it will create positive effects.
Okay, because this comes back to the question of how do we quantify whatever positive effects these are, and in terms of 104.1AB, if we decided to go there, how do we measure that? And you've obviously found a way of measuring that, because you have said it does not entirely compensate or offset.
Yes, my view is that the positive effects don't outweigh, if you like, the adverse effects of the proposal.
In your experience, how has the term reasonably difficult to see been approached? Has it been approached in the way Mr. Milne has put it to us, which is that it is a function of how many people might view something from a certain place, or has it been approached more in the way that I think Mr. Greaves has put it to us, that if you can see it, then it's not reasonably difficult to see it. Doesn't matter how many people may or may not turn up to look at it from that point.
To be honest, I'm not sure if it's been tested to the degree. I haven't seen too many cases on this, but my understanding is that it is about, if you can, it was more to Mr. Greaves' view, if you can see the building, it is not reasonably difficult to see.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions for you, Ms. Gathercole.
Ms. Gathercole, I have some questions for you. Can you look up PDP policy discussed before? I don't know, difficult to see. So asking Commissioner Lewis just to look up the particular PDP policy for me to talk to you about, but in the meantime, they've both given it to me. Your screen's quite small. Okay, I want to do this. I want to ask you some questions following on the reasonably difficult to see matter, and I'm looking at policy 6.3.3.1 clause B. Do you have that to hand?
I do.
And as I read that, it says all buildings and other structures and all changes to landform or other physical changes to the appearance of land. will be reasonably difficult to see. So wouldn't that include the hectares of revegetation and all the site works and every single thing proposed, not just the buildings?
Yes, I agree. I think it applies to all of those physical changes on the site.
Doesn't that mean, unless a piece of land is so invisible to anywhere, any kind of large-scale revegetation would fail? Any kind of large-scale attempt to undertake ecological improvements, restoration of degraded streams or wetlands would fail. And if it logically follows that with the exception of minutely small, practicably invisible outcomes, almost everything fails, is the policy valid?
Yes, in my view it is. And I think it's quite important. I guess you are looking at all elements of the proposal when you're assessing the application and in the context of this policy.
Okay. The track realignment and the easement that have been agreed, and I think you made comments at the start of your, well, through your little presentation that you felt there might be some positives to it, but they wouldn't be sufficient to change your overall view. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yes. I just want to clarify what you understand of it, because I have to say I had seen it as an easement only, not any physical works or physical changes, and I had seen it more in the nature of a side agreement between the applicant and a submitter that didn't actually take me anywhere in terms of assessing the existing track. But did you see it differently?
No, that's my understanding as well. It came through after submissions.
Okay. Okay. Ms. Gathercole, those are the only questions I had, thank you. And suffice it to say, your Section 42A report was very comprehensive. And so thank you for the care and effort in that, and obviously all the background work you've been undertaking assessing the application since it was lodged. I'll just make sure there are no other follow-up questions for you. No, no. I take it that would conclude the Office of Feedback portion?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Holm, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am.
Yes, hello there, welcome back. So I indicated earlier that I had something floating in my head about this issue of the conditions and the extent to which the assessing staff are indicating they haven't really felt that they've expressed much of a view on it. And it strikes me that I've already asked a few admittedly minor questions of architectural clarification, and you had indicated yesterday, furiously taking notes, that you might like an opportunity for something a bit more fulsome in writing. So we may have a brief adjournment at our end just to discuss things. I'll just confer with the commissioners about that. Yeah. Yeah, look, what we'd like to do is just take 10 minutes just to shore up our own thinking about what we'd like to discuss with you prior to you commencing any form of verbal right of reply as such. So if people would be willing to just stare at their screens until 11:40, and then we'll resume.
That sounds fine, sir.
Okay, thank you. Greetings, everyone. Sorry to keep you all on tenterhooks there. We took a few minutes more than I had estimated, so apologies for any inconvenience. Mr. Holm, we would like to just talk to you about a few things, just so you've got full knowledge of what's on our minds, and then we'd invite you to give us your thoughts of what you'd like to do about it. Our starting comment is that we've obviously asked some questions of architectural clarification. Other things that have come up in the hearing that we would specifically invite your reply to include relate to the discussion that was held on the back of house building and its internal possible uses and its consentability in terms of conditions that are very clear on what it can and can't do and be. And I accept you might think what's currently proposed is entirely appropriate, and that's whatever your position is, we would just like that. We would like confirmation on the applicant's acceptance or otherwise of all of the full recommendations in that lighting report, and that was discussed with Mr. Edmonds, about making sure the applicant is clear about what, how and when and how much for that. We'd like confirmation associated with the proposed nursery and whether that is going to involve any structures that we need to be aware of or that we would be consenting. We would like an understanding of any additional water tanks or structures that may be inherently needed associated with the various irrigation and fire dampening aspects of the proposal, and whether any additional tanks, where they'll be located. We'd also like, perhaps it's a matter more for you, Mr. Holm, from a legal point of view, a clearer sense of the applicant's position on the proposed revegetation and to what extent, if any, it is environmental compensation or offsetting positive effects under 1041AB, and or whether it's mitigation of effect of an adverse effect in the conventional term, or a bit of both, or something different. Just so we are clear on how the applicant would ask us to evaluate its proposal. All of those things are things you could be beavering away at, and I want to draw a line under that aspect for now. We would also ask, as I think I wouldn't say as commonplace, but is not unknown, that there might be a bit of a period of Mr. Edmonds sitting down with Ms. Gather-Cole and just marking up a word version of the proposed conditions with maybe some annotations of where there are differences, just so we can get a better sense of that, and pragmatically you would try to agree as much as you could, as is the norm. We also, and this is why we took a little bit of extra time, due to the adverse weather conditions of our site visit, we were not able to directly visit the track. And through the hearing, it has become clear that the potential effects of the proposal from some specific parts of the track do remain and are central to some of the concerns expressed against the application. And after considering it, we've agreed unanimously that in the interests of fairness for everyone, including the applicant, that we do need to revisit the site and expressly take in the track before we reached any kind of view on the proposal. All of us would be able to do that this coming Monday, the 30th. So I'm pleased to say I don't think it's going to create a particular additional delay, but the weather forecast on my cell phone does predict a bit of wet weather on that day. And what I would ask is, between now and then, if the applicant and Ms. Gather-Cole could put your heads together and give us advice on the best possible access point to get to the key bit of track without subjecting ourselves to a multi-hour trip either way. Not that it wouldn't be a wonderful experience, but it might be less wonderful in the rain. Those are the key things that have struck us, and I would reiterate, none of them in any way relate to us forming or having formed a view one way or the other yet. It's just about us wanting to make sure we have the best information to make the best decision. Having downloaded all that on you, Mr. Holm, do you want to take a couple of minutes to confer and then let us know how you'd like to proceed from here?
I think, sir, I can mostly respond.
Okay.
Right now, subject to anything that may come along, and I have Mr. Edmonds beside me here, and number one, I wanted to show you the back of house concept, and he has, Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Edmonds have got together, they've prepared the concept that shows the proposed back of house location and the scale of the building. I will include that in my reply, obviously, but I thought it would be useful to show the panel now exactly what was involved, just to assist the understanding before we close the hearing today. If that's acceptable to you, Mr. Edmonds can do that immediately.
Look, I'm as I said yesterday, I'm comfortable with you exercising something of a verbal highlights package now, without taking away from your ability to provide a full written response. And in that respect, I'm comfortable if you do want to show anything you want to within reason today, but perhaps let's you and I finish talking about this list of things and next steps, and then we can maybe turn to Mr. Edmonds and we can see it, okay?
So back of house, definitely taken the point, particularly raised by yourself, sir, and Commissioner Baker, that you need to be clearer as to what it is you're being asked to consent. So that point is fully accepted. Number two, sir, lighting. The lighting report is fully accepted, and I have, Mr. Edmonds has constructed a detailed condition in respect of lighting, which we obviously haven't had time to discuss with Ms. Gathercole, but that will be done in due course as part of the overall refinement of conditions that you've already raised with us. So that will be covered. The proposed nursery, structures, etc. You certainly will include in the reply how that particular facility is going to be located and whether there are any structures, etc., associated with it. So I'm told just in general that the water storage for it would be in the same area as the water storage for the lodge, which would be part of the back of house. So that covers your next point about the water tanks needed for irrigation. Where would they be located? And my understanding at this point is alongside the water tanks located in the back of house. We'll also have a visual assessment of that back of house structure, which includes the tanks, to make available with the closing. The next point, I believe, sir, was a clearer sense of revegetation and how it's regarded by the applicant. I think, and I'll cover this in more detail in the closing, but just as a general response, Commissioner Baker asked Mr. Milne in relation to paragraphs 24 and 25 of his evidence. And Mr. Milne made it very clear that the mitigation, there's planting around the building, which is mitigation planting, and the rest of the planting is put to you by the applicant as a positive effect, retiring farmland, reverting it to indigenous vegetation, which we would argue through Mr. Beale is a very large positive effect. But I'll come to that in more detail in the closing as well. In terms of the broader question on conditions, sir, that you raised, the starting point, of course, was the set of conditions attached to the Section 42A by Ms. Gathercole. Mr. Edmonds has added some conditions, particularly in relation to ecology and a bond. But we take your point entirely that it would be valuable for them to get together and work up a set of conditions which covers all of the concerns that have come through in the discussion. So that's work that will start immediately, which Mr. Edmonds will lead. And I think your final point, sir, was a track visit. And I guess Mr. Edmonds would be best to advise you on access points as to how to get to the key parts of the track. And also arrange access with the farmer who's currently grazing stock there.
Yes, but perhaps on that, Mr. Holman, and thank you, to avoid us getting lost and ending up on the wrong site, again, maybe what could be produced by Mr. Edmonds might be just a little A4 map with some little comments or annotations that maybe don't grant us the indulgence of confidence that has been taken to date, and treats us with a little bit more patience.
Yeah. Mr. Edmonds will prepare that, sir, and we'll get that to you as soon as possible, obviously, if you're planning to go on Monday.
Yeah, look, I think if we don't do Monday, the various commissioners' timeframes get a little bit crunchy, and we would be looking at another date several weeks in the future, which I suspect nobody wants to see. So I think we have to make Monday work, unless the fiercest Antarctic blizzard known in recent years between now and then shows up.
Yeah. I think I've covered off all your points there, sir. If there's anything that I missed, you might just remind me now. I think those were the key.
You did cover them off. Were there any other comments you wanted to just verbally run us through, which you're entitled to do? And then after you've done that, why don't we just have a quick discussion with Ms. Gathercole too, just about dates and timeframes?
I think the key issue, and I'll address this in detail in the reply, is what is the appropriate landscape test in this context? And clearly part of that submission is that we cannot be bound by something that is not yet formally formulated as council policy or law, as it has been suggested by Mr. Page particularly in paragraph 18 and 19 of the submission. But I won't try and take you through that now, but we'll certainly be addressing the way in which Mr. Milne has approached the landscape assessment and putting to you the reasons why we believe that it was a very comprehensive approach, not narrowly based, but on the other hand, not needing to comply with something that is not yet council policy or law. No, sir, I don't want to take any more of the panel's time. I think what I'd like to say is appreciate the fairness and efficiency with which the hearing has been conducted, and really appreciate that. It's been a
Thank you.
valuable.
Always accepted. Before we get carried away though, let me just make sure there is no other questions from the panel based on the discussion we've just had. No. Okay, so we've identified this coming Monday, the 30th, as the day for our visit. So, Mr. Edmonds, we really would need your advice on access and a little map by Friday, if that's doable. If Mr. Page is still there, I can't see if he is or not, but to confirm for the hearing, we do not feel. Oh, there we go. Hello, Mr. Page. On behalf of your client, thank you for the invitation to visit the restoration project that's been undertaken. We are satisfied, based on the ecological and landscape experts we've heard from, that we do understand sufficiently the nature and scale and issues associated with the revegetation proposed, and thank you for the offer, but we do not feel we need to visit your client's site. Thank you.
No, that's fine, thank you.
Okay, so visit on Monday. My suggestion would be that a week would be a fair expectation for Mr. Edmonds and Ms. Gathercole to discuss conditions, and perhaps another week after that. So say 2 weeks in total. We'd like to get everything in one go, including your full right of reply, Mr. Hall, which would take us to the 10th. Does that sound workable and agreeable for you?
So if I may just check with Mr. Edmonds on the conditions.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, 2 weeks.
So
So both the conditions package and the reply?
yes, and you know, the additional architectural clarification. Just it's not helpful to get stuff in drips and drabs. It's better just to get one set that's properly annotated and put together.
So is it helpful at all to view the proposed back of house now, or would you like to wait?
Look, let's just turn the give us a minute. We'll just get right back to thank you for your patience. We think that our consideration of that would be best placed in the context of a fuller explanation accompanying it. And so rather than a sort of a sneak preview now that just leaves us wanting more, let's just leave it as part of that comprehensive package, if that's agreeable to you as well.
So just to be clear, so Mr. Edmonds would and Mr. Mitchell would discuss the back of house detail as part of the discussion on conditions, and ensure the conditions incorporated whatever is relevant to achieve that.
Yeah, I think so. I think just do that process, reach your full comprehensive package, if you like, and then we can receive it at one go and properly work it through. I think our sense is we'd find that the more analytically robust, and that's what we'd like to do.
Thank you, sir. That's clear.
Mr. Chairman, could I just raise one nagging concern that I have? You're going to receive, obviously, a set of conditions which will be worked upon by the council officer and Mr. Edmonds. That's fine and appropriate. However, the case that my client has responded to so far is the case that was in the evidence. If there are substantial changes to the proposal, which we haven't had the opportunity to call evidence or make comments on, I would want reserved leave to do that.
Generally speaking, Mr. Page, first, we've never associated you with nagging, but secondly, it is common practice, as you know, that an applicant, having heard what everyone has to say, is free to make changes and amendments to a proposal and additional conditions through a right of reply in response to that hearing, and in a way that does not allow people to keep going around offering comments too. So in the first instance, this is going to be the applicant's right of reply, and we have asked it to consult with the officers. It could elect not to do that. And so I'm not in the first instance, I'm not seeing a a need to revisit that to another round. But Mr. Page, what I do want to say is that we don't know what we're going to get either in terms of what's presented, and we will, on receipt of it, undertake a review of its admissibility. And as you know, sometimes things stretch a response and constitute new evidence. We will undertake that assessment and satisfy ourselves. Rest assured that if we feel anything that constitutes a new, fundamentally new evidence or information that people haven't had a chance to see, we will take the appropriate procedural step at that point.
Yeah, well, all I can ask you to do, because I'm in the same position as you, I don't know what you're going to receive either, but can I ask you to make a direction that the conditions be served on the submitters, and we will either say nothing or raise an issue with you once we've seen it. But we don't know what we don't know until we've seen it.
Look, it goes without saying that everyone will receive the applicant's reply in writing. That's a matter of the process and record. As to the direction, we will receive the information and we will make a direction, even if that direction is that no further commentary is invited. Okay?
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. What we haven't done is just confirm that the time frame that's been discussed for consultation on conditions has been to ask Ms. Gaffercole if she's available through the next little while to offer an opinion and comment with her colleagues.
Yes, that suits me, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Did you have something?
I just wanted to point out that from the council's administrative point of view, 12 noon on the 10th of June will be the deadline, so that the administration team has time to process.
That's understood. Thank you, Commissioner Baker, and you've got that, Mr. Holm. Before we adjourn on the basis that we'll proceed as discussed, I just want to confirm for everyone that although we are having a discussion of conditions of consent, that should not in any way be taken as indicating any inclination on our part to grant consent. It is being asked purely so we can execute our duty and fully understand all eventualities. The reason for consulting with the staff is in particular because as a consent authority, the council is responsible for administering and monitoring conditions, and it's entitled to, I think, have a fair input into those conditions on that basis, and I think that's what's been asked. I don't wish to take up any more of people's time. It's just after 12 o'clock. I'm sure the day, if this room had windows, I would say the day is young and beautiful, but alas, it doesn't. So I hope the day is good for you all, and we look forward to hearing from you all in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel members.
Thank you, folks. We are adjourned. Thank you.